Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Well, good afternoon to everybody, wherever you may be. It's a very jovial start to the meeting this afternoon. We have an interesting range of subjects that Jon is going to talk to us about in a few moments, but including an RDP. Well, we're not holding a lottery to discover the identity of the RDP, in case anyone was thinking that we might. May I also add my welcome to the Channel Islands Specialist Society members who are joining us this afternoon. The only other announcement I would make is to confirm that the time of the next meeting on the 6th of May is 4 p.m. our time, which will be 8 a.m. Neil Donan's time in Victoria, British Columbia, and that will enable, I think, people to join that meeting worldwide. I will now introduce Jon. It's my great pleasure to introduce him. As well as being a fellow of the Society, he is also, as I think everybody knows, the Honorary Secretary. And I will now hand over to him to introduce his presentation this afternoon about Herm Island and the postal relations from that island. And it involves, I think, as we've already read, skulduggery, smugglers, inappropriate marriages, and a range of other interesting subjects. It's going to be a varied and interesting display. Jon, it's over to you. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me this afternoon. The title of my display today is Herm Island, Skulduggery, Smugglers, Inappropriate Marriages, a Post Office in a Pub, and even an RDP. But I could add to that, philanderers, opportunists, cockfighting, a prince and a princess, a curse, and Nazis. It's 300 years of the colourful tenants of this small Channel Island, told through their postal history and documents. My name's Jon Aitchison, and there is a printable handout of this display on the website. So let's start with showing you where Herm Island is. So the British Channel Islands lie to the west of the Cherbourg Peninsula in France and to the south of the south coast of Britain, more or less due south of Portland Bill. The Channel Islands comprise Orkney in the north, Jersey in the south, Guernsey in the west, and Sark in the east. And slap bang in the middle of those is Herm, and right next to it is the small island of Jetta that I'll also be mentioning. Now on this slide we have 3 stamps from Guernsey and Orkney that show the location of Herm within the Channel Islands. A little bit about the history first. In the Mesolithic period, Herm was a hunting ground. It was much bigger than it is today and probably connected to France. In the Neolithic period, 3000 to 2000 BC, Herm had its first settlers who were farmers, and they were featured on a 1957 local stamp issue. Around about 300 AD, there's evidence of Gallo-Roman occupation in the form of pottery. From 485 to 1569 AD, it was occupied by religious orders, and the island's earliest surviving buildings hail from this period in the 6th century. From 1570 until 1735, it was a retreat and a hunting ground and private resort for the governors of Guernsey. And then from 1737 to today, we come on to where our story begins. It was tenanted on a series of crown leases to a number of tenants who will be the subject of this display. I mentioned the 1957 local issue. Here's some artwork and a photobromide proof for Herm's 1957 Neolithic man issue. So the first tenants were farmers, and the first one was Peter Carey. He held the lease from 1737. The lease was for 61 years at £14 per annum, renewable every 21 years on payment of a further £42. When he died, his son Peter Carey Jr. took over, who died 4 years later. It then passed to a relative, Caroline Carey, who sold the lease to the De Jersey family. On the right here, we have a certified copy of the first lease, written and dated 1773. This was probably prepared for the sale by Caroline Carey. It's the earliest surviving document in private hands and possibly the earliest anywhere, as there's nothing this early in the Guernsey archives. By 1800, Pierre Morga had taken over as tenant of Herm. By profession, he was an innkeeper. His tenancy is the first record of an inn on the island. Now, from the outset, there were no end of complaints with him, and he had numerous run-ins with Guernsey authorities and arguments with locals. On one notable occasion in Guernsey, he was called a damned thief, a damned rascal and a damned smuggler before being beaten severely around the head with a stick. His troubled tenancy and financial difficulties forced him to sell up in 1815. He had been trying to sell the lease for some years, and this is a contract dated 1804 for the sale of Herm. And it also mentions his predecessors from the Jersey and Carey families. But on that occasion, the sale did not go ahead. We then come into the quarrying years. And this particularly features the Honourable Colonel John Lindsay, a philanderer. Lindsay purchased the lease from Pierre Morga in 1815 for £1,200. He bought the island as a home for his mistress and her 3 children. And quite amazingly, this was with the complete knowledge and approval of his wife, Lady Charlotte North, who was the daughter of the Earl of Guildford and lady-in-waiting to Queen Caroline. This would have been quite scandalous at the time, but I think the view was that Herm was far enough out of the way not to be noticed, and Lady Charlotte North was just essentially trying to get the mistress out of the way. Lindsay used Herm primarily for quarrying, and he did so on an industrial scale and literally ruined the island. In 1826, he died bankrupt. He had employed one Jonathan Duncan, who became his partner and in due course married his daughter. And here we have the earliest known letters from the John Lindsay tenancy. Both of them have markings. On the left, we have an inward letter to Herm dated 1823. And on the right is an outward one via Lindsay to the Governor of Jersey, Sir Colin Halkett, and that's his portrait inset into the letter there. It's undated, but we know it's between 1821 and 1826 because that was the dates that Colin Halkett was Governor of Jersey. So Jonathan Duncan, an opportunist. He rented Herm after Lindsay's death, then acquired the lease in 1830. He encouraged Lindsay to invest heavily until he was overextended. Aged 49, Duncan married Lindsay's daughter of 20. The island had been rich in Neolithic monuments, but he destroyed almost all of them. And the reason was it was much easier to harvest the large slabs of granite that the monuments were made out of, rather than hew it out of the bedrock. He built the smallest, or what's said to be the smallest prison in the world, which you can see on the bottom right-hand corner there. And this was primarily to lock away drunken and argumentative quarriers until they sobered up the following morning. He benefited hugely from Lindsay's massive investment, but nevertheless died bankrupt in 1838. And here we have 2 letters from the Duncan tenancy. 1831, Duncan to London, with the 7th type of Southampton ship letter mark. And 1836 from a visitor, and it was actually from a Mr. Treeman to his wife in Westminster. And he was on the island at the time on granite business, but he also reported on the poor state of the buildings on the neighbouring island of Jetta. We now go on to Benezer Fernie, the British Insurance Club. They bought the lease in 1838 and set up the Hayter Granite Company. They sublet the farm, but also set up the first school on Herm. He continued with industrial quarrying until the market collapsed due to cheaper tar macadam and cheap concrete. He then sold the lease to Stephen Twozod and Job Henry in 1854 for £1,500. And here we have a couple of letters from the Fernie tenancy period. 1847, an inward wrapper endorsed trust letter, and a letter basically explaining that the British government is interested in buying the lease. However, that doesn't seem to have come to anything. So Stephen Twozod and Job Henry, they were very good friends. They bought the lease in 1854 for £1,500 and then set up 2 farms. Twozod lived on Herm for 25 years as the grocer and boatman, but they then fell out spectacularly and ended up partitioning the island into 2 parts. They fell out so badly that in the end they sold the lease at a loss in 1860 for £1,000. And the document on this page is the one that they drew up to partition the island into 2 equal parts. Colonel Fielden came next, a tobacco and brandy smuggler. In 1867, Lieutenant Colonel Montague Joseph Fielden bought the lease of Herm for £1,000. Sorry, £4,000. And so I'm just finding my prompt page, if you bear with me. And it's quite apparent, if you look at it, that between 1860 and 1867, the lease had quadrupled in value. So one of the tenants in the intervening years had done rather well out of it. Colonel Fielden had been a very popular man both on Herm and in Guernsey, and he moved in the best social circles. He was a wealthy man. He spent a fortune on buildings and restoring the island's beauty after quarrying had ceased. But in 1869, he was caught with smuggled tobacco on the neighbouring island of Jetta. Then in 1873, he was caught with 50 barrels of smuggled brandy on Jetta and 27 more on his boat in Herm Harbour. He was fined heavily and only avoided imprisonment because of his social standing. In 1877, he sold up, went to South Africa, and was yet another person who died penniless. 1877 to 1889, we have an investor, scallywags and monks. 1877, James Considine bought the lease for £7,600 and sold it to Arthur Maxwell at a profit of £360. Maxwell set up a brewery, ran cockfights, kept 80 dogs, led a raucous life, and he defaulted on payments for the lease. It's said that he and his brother would like to race their carriages down the hill from the manor house at the top of the island to the island harbour, with all 80 dogs in full flight behind them, terrorising the residents and visitors alike. Because he defaulted, Considine took back the lease and sold it to a group of monks for £6,800 in 1882. The letter on this page, dated 1884, to the Queen's Receiver in Guernsey, was during the monks' tenancy, and it refers to salvage washed ashore, which was basically old wood. In 1884 to 1889, the monks and fishing. The first group of monks to lease the island were Trappist monks from France, Belgium and the Netherlands, and they didn't like it, so they very hastily left. The lease was sold again to Chartreuse monks, who used it as a stepping stone before moving to a new abbey in England. They put the lease of the island up for auction when they left at £7,500, but there was no buyers. It was then sold privately to John Linlocker, who was a successful Scottish businessman who ran a fishing fleet and salting and canning businesses in Scotland. It had been his aim to do the same on Herm with 280 boats there, but he couldn't get enough investment, so the scheme was abandoned. One of the investors in the scheme was the West Bank Lignites of Silesia, and they ultimately bought the lease in 1889 for £7,000. Now, the picture on the right here is Herm Harbour and Village in the mid-19th century, and the notable thing here is that the skyline is totally devoid of trees, which would very soon change with the next tenant. We now come on to the remarkable 26-year tenancy of Prince Gerhard Lebrecht Blucher von Wallstadt III, who bought the lease and moved in 1890. Blucher was 54. His second wife, Countess Elizabeth, was 22 years his junior, and she gave birth to their heir, Count Lothair, in Herm Castle the same year. Now, Herm Castle had previously been the manor house, but the prince put turrets on it and built a watchtower to turn it into a castle. That's still there, but it's reverted to the name of the manor house. Another rich man spent an absolute fortune on the island, extensive building, planted lots of trees, and amongst his numerous eccentricities, he introduced 27 wallabies. One night when he was away from the island, the prince's cook and butler got drunk and shot the wallabies. They, as a result, got 3 months imprisonment, but I hasten to add, not in that small prison on Herm. They were imprisoned in Guernsey. The prince's second wife died in 1894, and not being a man for long mourning periods, the following year he married his third wife, Princess Wanda. But the true story is that Prince had a passion for Princess Katharina Radziwill, who was a notorious writer of risque soap operas of the day, and he would like to have married her, but she was already married. So he asked instead if he could marry one of her 3 daughters, as you do. He wasn't a fussy man, any one of the 3 would have done. And it becomes even more bizarre because the girl's father then went and asked them if one of them would like to marry the prince. Anyway, the youngest one accepted, and it's generally thought that she accepted to escape the claustrophobic court life and achieve a degree of freedom. He married Wanda in 1895. He was almost 70. She had just turned 18. And on the right here, we see a letter on insignia notepaper with the crown insignia on the back of the envelope as well, written from Herm, and it's accepting a party invite, a children's party invite for the young Count Lothair. Now, you probably want to know what the prince and princess look like. So this next slide has a picture of the prince, which is definitely him, but there's a chance I got the wrong picture of Princess Wanda. The prince is kicked out. Before that, I just mentioned Count Lothair went on to marry Wanda's older sister, who was 10 years his senior. He was 20, she was 30. So it keeps up the family's tradition of inappropriate marriages. At that point, he was then Wanda's brother-in-law and stepson. But having said all that, it was a love match and they did live happily together all their lives. But anyway, World War I started, and in 1915, the prince was expelled from Herm as an enemy alien. And this was in spite of the fact that he was very well liked both on the island and Guernsey. He employed 30 local staff. He'd lived on the island for 25 years, and he was a known critic of Prussian militarism. It's said he died heartbroken a year later in Germany, and Princess Wanda, as a result, laid a curse on the next tenant of Herm. Mind you, from what you've heard about the previous tenants, I would imagine that the curse was retrospective as well. The letter here is quite interesting. This is the 1910 registered cover from Uzda in Minsk, which is now part of Belarus. And it's on Russian Royal Court, a Russian Royal Court insignia mourning envelope. And it was sent inward to Herm, but when it arrived there, the prince and his family were already on their way to Yorkshire via London. So Herm refused to accept it, and it was forwarded to their hotel in London. At London, it was accepted by the hotel, who then realised that the family had already left. So it appears they stuck it in a postbox. Because it had been already registered, it had to be compulsorily re-registered, receiving a posted out of course cachet, and was surcharged 6pence in postage due before it finally reached the family at Horton Hall in Yorkshire. So after the war, we come on to the tenancy list. He leased Herm at £900 a year and Jetta at £100 a year. The island inspired several works by himself, notably Fairy Gold, one of his more famous novels, but also novels by Vita Sackville-West and the various members of the Bloomsbury set, in particular Virginia Woolf. Now, he had been really good friends with another famous novelist, D.H. Lawrence, and they had planned to buy a yacht and sail to the South Seas. But when Mackenzie bought the lease to Herm, that idea was abandoned, and it completely wrecked his friendship with Lawrence, who bore a grudge and years later wrote the allegorical skit A Man Who Loved Islands, which is essentially biographical about Mackenzie, and it tells the tale of a man who moves from larger to smaller islands and his personality contracts at the same time. Herm proved a financial drain, and Mackenzie believed that Wanda's curse had failed him to, or caused him to lose a film contract, amongst other things. So in 1923, he sold and he moved to the smaller neighbouring island that he rented of Jetta. Now, I don't actually have any letters from Mackenzie when he was on Herm, but here are two from him on Jetta, 1927 and 9, I think. They're both on headed notepaper. One's typed and signed by him, the other's handwritten and signed by him. The picture of Compton Mackenzie inset there. Next up, we have Lord Percival Perry from 1923 to 39. Lord Perry was the head of the Ford Motor Company in the UK. He had imported the first ever Ford cars to Britain in 1903 and was responsible for the construction of the Ford plant at Dagenham. He was aware of Mackenzie's financial straits and ended up buying the lease from him at a rather knockdown price of £6,000 when he was in fact prepared to pay far more, and that was in 1923. He bought the first motor to Herm, which was a Model T Ford truck, which was later entombed in the harbour extension and still is in the harbour this day, entombed in concrete. He rather bizarrely wanted to paint everything on the island orange or blue. Orange was the colour of the original Ford badge and blue was the later colour which Ford still used today. He installed a golf course and he changed the name of the hotel to the White House to acknowledge his American connections. Perry permitted day trippers, and on the right here we have a permit from 1924 permitting a party to visit the island. He had a considerable staff there and an entourage and family, and what with the day trippers, he decided they needed a post office. So he got the British Post Office to open a sub office there on the 1st of May 1925, and that was open for half an hour a day in the local pub, the Mermaid Tavern. They provided a double circle hand stamp, which is now very scarce, and you can see it on the postcard at the bottom there, 2 good strikes on 2 halfpence PUC commemoratives. The post office ultimately closed on the 30th of November 1938 due to a reduction in mail. 2 more items from that period. On the left is an envelope to the surgeon captain of HMS Nelson at Portsmouth. It's got the Herm double circle cancel on, and this is on Perry's personal crested notepaper, and the inset crest is from the back flap. On the right is the only known cover with the Herm, first type of Herm registered label on. It's to Cape Province, and it has 3 strikes of the Herm double circle cancel. (1940 to 45), the Channel Islands were occupied by German occupying forces, and they landed on Herm on the 20th of July 1940. Now, it wouldn't be correct to consider the occupying forces as tenants, because they never showed any inclination to pay any rent or sign a lease. But there was a quite sad story about a man called Frank Dixon. Now, Frank Dixon got a call from a friend of his who was Perry's only remaining employee on the island, and he was there as a caretaker. And the caretaker had asked Dixon to join him on the island. Dixon went over, and then the caretaker scarpered and got one of the last boats back to England, leaving Frank Dixon stuck there when the Germans arrived. So he carried on for a while as caretaker, and then he was joined by a husband and wife team, the Lepages, who stayed beyond the end of the war. Dixon saw his role as making things as difficult as possible for the Nazis, and as a result, he was thrown off the island. On the right of this slide, we have a Guernsey States Meteorological Office card. They continued to keep records during the war, and this is a reference card for Herm from 1942. Two more occupation documents. On the left is a travel permit allowing the Lepage's daughter Marguerite to visit them on Herm from Guernsey on Christmas Eve 1943. And on the right is the only known Red Cross letter from Herm. Another is known inward to Herm, and this is from the caretaker, Mrs. Lepage, to her mother in England in 1944. 1945 and liberation comes along. The Channel Islands were liberated on the 9th of May 45. The Lepages stayed until 1946, but meanwhile the States of Guernsey bought the island of Herm from the Crown. On the right hand side here we have two Forces Air letters from the Lepages on Herm to their son on active service, sent just after liberation. And on the left is a 1945 inward air letter to the Lepages on Herm from their son on active service in Italy with 249 Squadron of the RAF. A.G. Jeffreys, 1946 to 49. Guernsey decided to advertise for the tenancy of Herm in the Times, and they had four credible applications. One was as a health spa, another for a luxury hotel, one for a sort of a holiday camp. They were going to cover the island in chalets. But they let it to A.G. Jeffreys, who was a glove manufacturer in his 50s. He employed more than 1,000 people, so I suppose they took that as a good indication that he was a sound businessman. I also presume glove manufacturing wasn't automated at the time. He briefly trialled a franking machine, a near-post franking machine for 1 month. And this is now one of the rarest franking machine marks. A couple of decades ago, I decided to join the Franking Meter Group study circle in the hope of laying my hands on some of these. I wasn't successful, but a number of the members happened to mention that the scarcest franking machines in the world at the time were early Olympic ones that could sell for up to a couple of £100 each. And at the time, these were already selling for several times that. Anyway, within a year, Jeffreys realised that he'd taken on far too much and was looking for a way out. Now, it's Jeffreys that started the local post, and that ran from 1949 until 69. And his motive for starting it was to defray the cost of carrying tourist mail from the island. Lots of tourists were visiting, leaving postcards. He was carrying them to Guernsey, where they entered the GPO system free of charge. He also started a pigeon post, as Herm had no phone or radio connection until 1950. Now, he was advised in this endeavour by the island manager, James Burch, and James Burch got his uncle to design the pigeon post stamp. And on the right here, top left, we have a die proof, and at the bottom we have the artwork for the full sheet of the pigeon post stamps. But these are worded pigeon postage, and the post office objected to those words, so they were changed to pigeon service. And top right, you have the only first day use of a flown pigeongram flimsy with the pigeon service stamp on, and it's addressed to Captain William Burch, the man who designed the stamp. Now, until a few years ago, that was the story of how it started, until I established that the James Burch, who was the island manager in 1949, was the same James Burch who signed the Roll of Distinguished Philatelists in 1960. And it's fair to assume that he hadn't risen from novice collector to those elevated heights in 11 years, so he must have already been a serious philatelist in 1949. You can therefore imagine that he was the genesis of the idea and talked Jeffreys, the island tenant, into it. Now, once you realise that, there was a glaring clue that had been there all along. The Postal Service started on the 6th of May, the anniversary of the issue of the penny black. And either that's a remarkable piece of serendipity, or who else but a philatelist would do it. We come on to the 59-year tenancy of Major Peter Wood and his wife Jenny, who visited the island, liked it and decided to buy it in 1949. They had the longest tenancy since the Norman Church. The local post flourished, carrying up to 50,000 items of mail a year. And I should stress that's not first day covers. That's tourist postcards and mail to the large resident population of people that worked and lived there. That's far more than many small UPU issuing countries such as Pitcairn, Tristan, South Georgia, South Shetland, etc. On the right hand side, we have a registered parcel piece, and this has 2 local post stamps on, and they are the same issue as the ones I showed you earlier for the Neolithic man set. 1969 brought postal independence to the Channel Islands. And on the 1st of October 1969, when Guernsey became postally independent, Herm local stamp issues had to stop, along with all the other local issues of the Channel Islands. A new Guernsey Sub Office was opened in the Herm shop, and that used Guernsey stamps. They provided 3 new cancellors, and at the bottom here we have the Herm Island letter canceller. Top left is the packet canceller, and top right is the parcel canceller. They needed a post box. The original 1923 to 38 George V box was still in situ on the end of a wall at the Long Barn Tea Room next to the Mermaid Tavern, and it had been sealed up for decades. In the photograph on the top left, you can make out the box, and you might just make out the seal across the letter posting gap. The local post in the 1950s initially used a bird box post box, top right, and that was replaced by 2 barrels, the older one bottom left and the newer one bottom right. The Guernsey Post Office decided to refurbish the original 1920s George V box, which they relocated to the wall of the shop where the post office was, and painted it blue, which is the Guernsey Post Office colour. And there was a certain irony to this, because you may recall that Lord Perry had a desire to paint everything blue, and he asked if he could paint the post box, but it was turned down. However, with postal independence, he got his wish. The next generation takes over. The Wood's daughter, Penny, was born on the island in 1950 in Lady Perry's house. And she and her husband, Adrian Hayworth, took over the running of Herm in 1980. The island then had over 50 staff, a school. The Hayworths alone planted over 14,000 trees. Tourist business was booming, and at last the island was financially secure. On the right here, we have 3 business reply envelopes from the White House Hotel from the 1980s and 90s. And when I was staying on the White House Hotel once, I went and saw the manager and asked if he had any of these. Well, he very patiently explained at length that they didn't have the business reply service any longer, and so they couldn't be used. And anyway, they were only good for mailing things to the White House Hotel. I persevered and tried to explain that none of this mattered to a philatelist, so he agreed. And rather than give me 1 or 2 envelopes, he gave me the whole box full. So it goes to show, if you don't ask, you don't get. We now come on to the final chapter. In 2008, the Hayworth retired, and they sold the lease to a charitable trust run by John and Julia Singer. And it's a very romantic story. They had their first date and fell in love on Herm 14 years earlier. So in summary, Herm's tranquil existence for millennia was severely tested during the tenancy period from the 18th century onwards. Through postal history and documents, we've met the colourful tenants who have shaped the island in recent centuries, and Herm now prospers. It is idyllic, and it's still philatelically active. On the right-hand side here, you can see a 2016 Guernsey Post Office issue for Herm's Ramsar status as a wetland conservation area. Thank you for watching. I'm Jon Aitchison. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, John. Over to you, Richard.
Yes, thank you very much indeed for that interesting presentation, John. We now move on to questions, and Mark, I'm going to have to hand back to you because you're in charge of the questions, and I can't even see how many there are. So
No, that's right. What we've done, Richard, is we've managed the questions.
I know,
so that only the host can see them. So
right.
Yes. So the good news is, John, if you're ready, we've got 4 questions at least. Here we go.
Okay.
Right. All right. Let's start with the first one, which comes to you from Nick Hervey. Nick asks, with regard to the sale of the leases in the early years, how widely was the sale of the leases advertised?
Well, in the early years, I really couldn't say. Most of the tenants appear to have found their own buyers. And I understand that the Guernsey authorities had to approve the buyers. But by and large, it appears to have been a matter of personal contact rather than wide-scale advertising. And the exceptions to that were when Compton Mackenzie took over after the First World War, and when Guernsey let the lease after the Second World War.
Thank you. Next question comes to you from Patrick Reed. Patrick asks regarding Prince Blucher, was Prince Blucher descended from General Blucher of Waterloo fame?
Yes, grandson.
Okay. Chris King has expanded in quite a lot of detail with regard to Mr. James Alfred Burch. Chris, there's an awful lot of information you provided there. Thank you so much for doing that, but I'm not sure I want to read it all out. If anyone's really interested, James Alfred Burch, of course, was an RDP. He was also a fellow of the Royal. He lived from 1888 to 1969. I'll stop there. There's an awful lot of interesting information about the man's life, as obviously he was a very renowned philatelist. John, Michael Seffy asks, what is the area of the island and how big is the current population?
Now, the island, I won't swear to this, Michael, but I think it's about 1.25 miles long and about half a mile wide at its widest point. But of that order, don't take that as gospel. The last population census I had of it was during the Woods tenancy, and it won't be any smaller. At the time, they had 50 staff alone. Now, in terms of family members, there's probably the best part of 10 more of them. And they have numerous properties on the island that can be rented all year round. So my guess is probably at any given time, another 30 or so people renting properties there. So we're probably looking at not far short of 100 people at any given time. But that's swollen massively in the summer months by tourist visitors. I mean, that can be as many as several thousand a day.
Right, thank you. And by the way, if anyone else has got any other questions, do please put them in the chat box. John is very happy to answer them. Patrick Reed asks another question here for you, John. With regard to Ramsar, he asks, what does Ramsar mean?
Yeah, I had to look that one up myself. It's an organisation that is concerned with conservation of wetlands, and apparently they had their first meeting in either Iraq or Iran at a place called Ramsar. So it became known as the Ramsar Trust. And Herm does have some areas of wetland, so they've affiliated to it. And the Guernsey Post Office then marked that affiliation with a stamp issue.
Right, some more questions have come in. I don't think you're surprised to hear that this next one is from Gavin Wood, because the question is, where did you get the occupational weather card from?
Well, oddly enough, there's someone else watching that's told me they've got one of those as well. Gavin, you'll know it is our friend Andy Rundle in who used to be in Guernsey, now in Jersey, and there was a time when he had about a dozen of them for sale. So you missed out there.
By the way, he has now moved back to Guernsey again.
Ah, right.
He was in Jersey for a little while in connection with his latest girlfriend, but I understand there's been a bit of a falling out, and so he's moved back to Guernsey.
Right.
Anyway, Kim Stuckey would like to know, has the pigeon service local been used on any other commercial mail?
The only commercial use was on pigeongrams, and they are scarce as anything. But when they installed the phone in 1950, the pigeon service was abandoned. And then they used up the remainder of the stamps by attaching them to quite small envelopes, about the size of the pigeongram flimsy, and cancelling them for sale in the island shop to collectors and tourists. But genuine commercial use is rare.
Daniel Grabani would like to know, John, over the years, to what extent was the lease for Herm connected to the lease for Jetta?
As far as I'm aware, only on the two occasions that I've mentioned, which was Colonel Fielding, and he was the brandy smuggler, you may remember. And after his tenancy, the states who had to advise the Crown on who they were let to decided then to separate the two tenancies, hopefully to avoid it becoming another smuggling haven. Then the next time was when, after the First World War, they let it to Compton Mackenzie, and both islands were let. But other than that, I think they've been let individually.
Right. Thank you. Simon Greenwood very kindly calculated that the area of the island would be 480 acres or 200 hectares. Thank you, Simon. Michael Seffi says, so it's a day trip from St. Peter Port. Yes, Michael, it is.
Yeah, 20 minutes on a boat, Michael.
Both Ingo Nessel and Vincent West ask you the same question, John. They would both like to know, how did you get interested in Herm?
Well, it's hard to say. But prior to this, I suppose, yes, my prime interest used to be Lundy Island. And if anyone collects British locals, you invariably, when you buy collections of one, end up with all the others. And so that drew it to my attention. And then it just started to develop from there. I'm obviously very keen on the locals as well, but I haven't put many of those in on this display.
Okay. Bob Medland just provides a bit of clarification about that about Ramsar. It's not so much a trust, it's a convention between many participating countries for the conservation of wetlands. So that's just a bit of clarification on that point. Mike Moody would like to know about the Burch family. He said, did the Burch family live in Wallasey in Cheshire? He asked that because he has a copy of a prisoner of war postcard from Jersey in March 1946. Is that likely to be connected?
Well, I'm going to give you an uncertain answer. Wallasey rings a bell with me, so it could well be that they did. However, Wallasey is also the location of Hilbrae Island, which is another British local, and it's also where Peter and Eileen Kelly, who ran the Ordinary Parcel Delivery Service, hailed from. So I don't know if I associate it with James Burch or one of those others.
I could just add there that James Burch was a director of a corn milling company in Lancashire, so it's only next door.
Could be.
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Chris. John, Mark Andave is quite interested in this business about the pigeon mail. He says, are there any pigeon mails known? If yes, how many and on how many occasions that happened? Once, twice or more? I think basically if you can just elaborate on the use of that pigeon mail.
Well, it was in use for a period of about 6 months until the first phone line was established. And when it started up, anyone could go into the shop and say they wanted to send a pigeongram, and it was flown from the lofts on Herm to one on the end of Albert Pier in Guernsey, where the staff there removed it and phoned through the urgent message. But of course, the problem was that as soon as collectors became aware of this, they all wanted to do it. And of course, they only kept, I'm guessing, a dozen pigeons or so. And so it had to be kept for genuine emergencies when they wanted a doctor or something of that sort. So consequently, a lot of pigeongrams were stamped and cancelled for collectors, but didn't actually get flown. So the flown ones are considerably more valuable and considerably rarer than the ones that were just done for collectors. Now, how do you know if it's flown? It's always difficult. I mean, one thing is it has to be folded and rolled up to fit into the tube, so you'd expect some creasing. However, that doesn't stop someone doing that to one that they bought in the shop. So there's also an element of what does the message say and does it look genuine? By and large, you can spot the ones that have been doctored.
Right, thank you, John. The final, well, I was going to say final, but a couple more just popped in. Another question here from John Spencer, who just would like to know, are there any fishing boats based at Herm?
No. Oh, sorry, I'll rephrase that. No commercial fishing boats. There may be amateur fishermen that pull in there and go out and fish, but no fishing on an industrial or commercial scale. Right.
Actually, that was the last question. Everything else is people explaining what a lovely presentation you've given us today, John, and also John Biddlecombe reminds us that New Zealand also ran a pigeon post service off of Auckland. So yeah, so thank you for that point, John. Right, I think, Richard, that is the last question for John. So I'm going to hand back to you.
Thank you very much indeed. And once again to John for a first-class presentation this afternoon and for answering the questions at the end. I'm now going to hand back to Mark because he has very kindly agreed to present the vote of thanks. And when I knew that the subject was to do with the Channel Islands or Herm, part of the Channel Islands, who better could I ask to do the vote of thanks than a member of the Channel Islands Specialist Study Circle. So back to you then, Mark.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Yes, I'm indeed a member of the Channel Islands Specialist Society. And I'll tell you what, I mean, I've known John for many years, so I was also delighted when you asked me to give the vote of thanks. In fact, it's thanks to John that I'm a member of the Channel Islands Specialist Society, and as a consequence of that, I became a member of the Royal. So John, it's all your fault. But seriously, John has not only described in an entertaining manner the history of the numerous colourful and interesting characters who have been the tenants of this small island, but he has shared with us some exceedingly rare items of postal history and unique items of artist visuals and photobromide proofs. With so few people living on the island, it is not surprising that there is very little in the way of correspondence from the 18th and 19th centuries. John has today shown us what are by and large the only surviving examples of such mail. Whilst I know quite a bit about the history of the island, having been on a number of occasions and collected postcards, local stamps and postal history of Herm for many years, John has today explained things of which I was unaware. So I thank him for having educated me further about what is one of my favourite places in the world. I've had the pleasure of spending some time with Penny and Adrian Hayworth when they were the island's tenants, but John has enlightened us all about their predecessors and indeed their successors. John has managed to obtain and shown us today the earliest known letters to and from the island, as well as the rare examples of the Red Cross message forms that were sent to and from the island during the German occupation in World War II. Added to this, we've seen some rare survivors of the correspondence and envelopes from when the tenants were the German prince and his princess, including that much redirected registered letter from the small town of Udster, which is near Minsk, that dates from 1910. As for mail from when the post office was operated in the Mermaid Tavern from 1925 to 1938, examples of mail cancelled with the Herm double circle postmark are indeed scarce. I have one or two, John has quite a few, but they are not easy to come by. Although day trippers were permitted to the island during those years, the landing permits are really rare pieces of ephemera, so that was a real treat to see one of those. The Herm meter mark from the summer of 1948 is likewise very scarce, publicising as it was that Herm could give you an enchanting holiday amid peace and tranquility. That would have been exactly the kind of holiday that post-war Britain needed as it recovered from the horrors and deprivations of the Second World War. Though we've been treated to see such scarce material today. And John brought the story up to date with brief glimpses of the 20 years of the use of local carriage labels to take the post from Herm to Guernsey for mailing onwards to the world, followed by the opening of a branch post office on Herm when Guernsey became postally independent from the UK, and the use of Guernsey stamps and associated postal services, including those business reply service envelopes from the White House Hotel. So I'd like to invite all of our fellows, members and guests to join me in showing our thanks and appreciation for today's presentation in the usual manner. Thank you, John, for a very enjoyable and informative talk.
Thank you.
Well done, John.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that vote of thanks, Mark. And once again, I add my own personal thanks. We've seen some incredible material, extremely scarce
Did you
items,
enjoy that?
and I thought it was absolutely first class.
Good.
Thank you very much indeed. And I think we all have the support of everybody present in sharing those opinions of the display that we've just seen. Moving on then, Mark, I believe you've got the certificate with you. We don't let our displayers go without anything at all. We show you the virtual certificate as a memento of your presentation this afternoon, and then you will receive the paper copy through the post in due course.
Thank you very much.
It's my great pleasure to mention that now to you, John.
Thank you.
Yes, yeah, and that's exactly what it looks like. There'll be one of those mailed to you, as you said, shortly. Okay.
I think then, Mark, that brings out the formal part of the meeting to a close, and you'll cease recording from now on, I believe.
I'll do that now then.
Okay.